see our esteemed members play out the respective speeches in both men. Maybe we'll see and understand why Buckley's portion of the speech was pretty much hidden from public view for a long time. Thanks.
Thank you, Jay, for that was actually quite interesting. And I'm going to pause for a second. I'm going to make sure we have our Zoom stuff going, because it would be really nice to get the Zoom recorded. Are we set?
It's working now.
Oh, great. So, Baldwin Buckley debate. This play is an adaptation of the debate that took place, as Jay mentioned, on February 18, 1965, at the Cambridge Union Society in Cambridge, England, the oldest continuously running debate society in the world. This historic debate, featuring William F. Buckley and James Balwin, clearly defined the feelings about race at the time, many of which are still relevant today. It's my joy to moderate this reenactment of this historic event with Fred Bredt in the role of William F. Buckley and Solomon Gibson III representing James Balwin. Let's begin. Welcome to the Cambridge Union. The motion before the House tonight is the American dream is at the expense of the American Negro. Today, we have Mr. William F. Buckley and Mr. James Baldwin to debate the question. Gentlemen, please introduce yourselves.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is William Buckley, and I'm editor of National Review. It is quite an honor to be invited to the debate tonight. I feel home here. As you may know, I went to boarding school at St. John's some 30 years ago, very near where the Magna Carta was signed. I do wish to say that I have a long history of defending America against the many critics who wish to tear down our great nation. Most importantly, I tell you that because I oppose Mr. Baldwin and all those like him despise the American way of life and challenge the root and branch of the American approach to free civil order, I am by no means racist.
Hello, my name is James Baldwin. I see the debate tonight as a sign of progress, and there has been progress. Progress with the Civil Rights Act, progress with my friend Martin Luther King winning the Nobel Prize, and progress with this new war on poverty. But we have far to go. It is necessary, while in darkness, to know that there is light somewhere. To know that in oneself, waiting to be found, there is light. I've never met my opponent, Buckley, but I certainly know of him. I hear he is even running for mayor of New York City in the new conservative party banner. I don't think he will be successful.
It is now a very great pleasure and a very great sense of honor that I ask Mr. Buckley to speak. He will speak false to the motion that the American dream is the expense of the American Negro. Mr. Buckley, please begin.
Thank you, Madam President, and members of the Cambridge Union. It seems to me that of all the indictments that Mr. Baldwin has made of America in his copious literature of protest, the one that is most striking involves, in effect, the refusal of the American community to treat him as other than The American community has refused to do this. The American community, almost everywhere he goes, treats him with a kind of unction, a kind of satisfaction at posturing carefully before his flagellations of our civilization. That quite indeed properly commands the contempt. So, it is impossible, in my judgment, to deal with the indictment of Mr. Baldwin unless one is prepared to deal with him as unless one is prepared to say to him, the fact that your skin is black is utterly irrelevant to questions and arguments that you raise. The fact that you sit here and will no doubt use your rhetorical devices to lay the entire weight of the Negro ordeal on your own shoulders is irrelevant to the arguments we are here to discuss. The gravamen of Mr. Baldwin's charges against America are not so much that our civilization has failed him and his people, that our ideals are insufficient, but that we have no idea, that our ideals are rather some sort of superficial coding which we come up with at any given moment to justify whatever commercial and noxious experiment we are engaged in. But even so, to the extent many of you may find this a contemptible observation, I agree. I don't think it matters that there are, I don't think it matters that Mr. Baldwin can write in his book, The Fire, in which he threatens America with the necessity for us to jettison our entire civilization. The only thing that the white man has that the Negro should want, he said, is power. And he's treated from coast to coast in the United States with a kind of unctuous servitude, which in point of fact goes beyond anything that was ever expected by the most servile Negro preacher by a Southern family. I'm proposing to pay him the honor this night of saying to him, Mr. Baldwin, I'm going to speak to you without any reference whatever to those surrounding protections which you are used to in virtue of the and we need to ask the question, what shall we do about it? What shall we do about it, Madam President? What shall we in America try to do, for instance, to eliminate those psychic humiliations, which I will join Mr. Baldwin in believing are the very worst aspects of this discrimination? Some statistics, and I don't think they are insignificant. They are certainly not insignificant in a world which attaches a considerable importance to material properties. It is in fact the case that 7/10 of the white income in the United States is equal to the income made by the average. I don't think this is an irrelevant statistic, ladies and gentlemen, because it takes a capitalization today in 1965 $15,000, $16,000, $17,000 per job. This was a capitalization that was not created exclusively by Negro travail. My great-grandparents worked too, presumably yours did also. I don't know of anything that was ever been created without the expenses. All of you who hope for a diploma here in Cambridge are going to do that at the expense of considerable effort. And I would thank you. Please do not belie the fact that there is a considerable amount of effort that went into the production of a system which grants a greater degree of material well-being to the American people than is enjoyed by 95% of the other peoples of the human race. So you may find this a contemptible observation, but I don't think it matters that if there are 35 millionaires among the Negro community, there are 35. If there were 20 million millionaires among the Negro community in the United States, I would still agree with you. But what we have here is a dastardly situation. But I'm asking you not to make politics pro-flies, to use the fleeted phrase of Professor Oakeshott, but rather consider what in fact is it that we Americans ought to do. What are your instructions that I am to take back to the United States? I want to know what it is we should do, and especially I want to know whether it is time that we abandon the American dream. What is it in fact that we ought to do, for instance, to avoid the humiliations frequently described by Mr. Baldwin as being part of his own experience in his lifetime? At the age of 12, you will find, on reading his book, that he trespassed outside of the ghetto of Harlem and was taken by the scruff of the neck by a policeman on 42nd Street and Madison Avenue. He said, "Here, you nigger, go back to where you belong." 20 years later, he goes in and asks for Scotch whiskey at the airport in Chicago, and is told by the white barman that he is obviously underage and under the circumstances cannot be served. I know from your faces that you share with me the feeling of compassion, the feeling of outrage that this kind of thing should have happened. What in fact are we going to do with this policeman, and what in fact are we going to do with this bar? How are we going to avoid those kinds of humiliations which are visited upon members of the minority race? The first element is concern. We've got to care that it happens. We've got to do what we can to change the warp and woof of moral thought in society in such a fashion as to make it happen less and less. Let me urge this point to you, which I can do with authority, my friends, the only thing I can tonight, and that is to tell you that in the United States, there is concern for the Negro. Now, well, courtesy, Madam President. But meanwhile, I'm saying to you that the engines of concern in the United States are working. The presence of Mr. Baldwin here tonight is in part, a reflection of that concern. You cannot go there is, he's a charlatan and ultimately a boring man. Precisely because he is then speaking in the kinds of abstractions that do not relate to human experience. The trouble in America, where the Negro community is concerned, is very. I urge those of you who have an actual rather than purely idealized interest. To read the book Beyond the Melting Pot by Professor Blaze, also co-author of The Lonely Craft, a prominent Jewish intellectual, points to the fact that the situation in America where the Negroes are concerned is extremely complex as a result of an unfortunate conjunction of two factors. One is, of course, the dreadful effects of perpetuate discrimination by many individual American citizens as a result of that final and ultimate concern which some people are truly trying to agitate. The other is a result of the failure of the Negro community itself to make certain exertions that were made by other minority groups during the American experience. If you can stand a statistic not of my own making, let me give you one which Professor Blazer considers to be relevant. He says, for instance, in 1900, there were 3,500 Negro doctors. In 1960, 3,900, an increase of 400. Is this because there were no opportunities, as has been suggested by Mr. Baldwin? Implicitly in his work? No, says Professor Blazer. There are a great many medical schools, by no means practice discrimination, who are anxious to receive and train Negro doctors. There are scholarships available to put them through. But it is in fact that particular energy, which he remarks, was so noticeable in the Jewish community and to a certain and lesser extent in the Italian Irish, that for some reason is not there. We should focus on the necessity to animate this particular energy. But he comes to the conclusion, which strikes me as plausible, that the people who can best do it, who can do it most effectively, are the Negroes themselves. Let me conclude, ladies and gentlemen, by reminding you that where the Negro is concerned, the danger, as far as I can see at this moment, is that they will seek to reach out for some sort of radical solutions on the basis of which the true problem will be obscured. They've done a great deal to focus on the fact of white discrimination against Negroes. They've done a great deal to agitate a moral concern. But where, in fact, do they go now? They seem to be slipping, if you read carefully, for instance, the words of Mr. Bayard Rustin, towards some sort of Procrustean formulation that ends up less urging the advancement of the Negro than the regression. 14 times as many people in New York City born of Negroes are illegitimate as whites. This is a problem. Shall we address it by seeking out laws that encourage legitimacy in white people? Unfortunately, this tends to be the rhetorical momentum of which some arguments are taking.
One thing you might let them do, Mr. Buckley, is let them vote in Mississippi.
I agree. I agree. I couldn't agree with you more. Except, lest I appear too ingratiating, which is hardly my objective here tonight, I think what is actually wrong in Mississippi, sir, is not that not enough Negroes are voting, but that too many white people are voting. Booker T. Washington said, the most important thing where the Negroes are concerned is not that they hold public office, but that they are prepared to hold public office. Not that they vote, but that they are prepared to vote. We ought to do with the Negroes, what are we to do with the Negroes that have taught Negroes in Mississippi to despise Governor Ross Barnett? Shall we then teach them to emulate their cousins in Harlem and adore Adam Clayton Powell Jr.? It is much more complicated, sir, than simply a question of giving them the vote. If I myself were a constituent of the community of Mississippi at this moment, what I would do is to vote to lift the standards of the vote so as to disqualify 65% of the white people who are voting. I say then that what we need is a considerable amount of frankness that acknowledges there are two sets of difficulties. The difficulties of the white person who acts as white people, and brown people, and black people do all over the world to protect their own vested interests. Races have. The entire world suffered from a kind of racial narcissism, which tends to convert every contingency into such a way as to maximize their own power and accuracy. But we must also reach through to the Negro people and tell them that their best chances are in a mobile society. And the most mobile society in the world, my friends, is the United States of America. The most mobile society in the world is the United States of America, and it is precisely that mobility which will give the opportunities to the Negroes which they must be encouraged to take. But they must not, in the course of their ordeal, be encouraged to engage the kind of cynicism, the kind of despair, the kind of iconoclasm urged upon them by Mr. Baldwin in his recent works. There's one thing I can tell you, and I believe with absolute authority where the United States is concerned. If it ever comes to a confrontation between a continuation of our own sort of ideals, stock of which, granted, like most people in the world, tend to lavish only every now and then on public enterprise, reserving it so often for our own irritations and pleasures. But the fundamental friend of the Negro people in the United States is the good nature, is the generosity, is the good wishes, the decency, the fundamental decency that do lie and preserves it. And these must not be laughed at. Under no circumstances must they be laughed at, and under no circumstances must America be addressed and told that the alternative to the status quo is to overthrow the civilization which we consider to be the faith of our fathers, indeed the faith of your fathers. This is what must animate whatever meliorism has come, because if it does finally come to a confrontation, a radical confrontation between giving up what we understand to be the best features of the American way of life, whose level is indistinguishable as far as I can see from the European way of life, then we will fight the issue. And we will fight the issue not only in the Cambridge Union, we will fight it as you were once called to do on the beaches, on the hills, on the mountains, and on the landing. And we will be convinced that just as you won the war against a particular threat to civilization, you were nevertheless waging war in favor of and for the benefit of Germans, your own enemies. And just as we are convinced that if it should ever come to that kind of confrontation, our own determination to win the struggle will be a determination to wage war not only for us, but for you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Buckley. And now, once again, the motion before the House tonight is the American dream is at the expense of the American Negro. It is my very great pleasure to ask Mr. Baldwin to speak in favor of this motion. Mr. Baldwin.
Good evening. I find myself not for the first time in the position of a kind of Jeremiah. For example, I don't disagree the inequalities suffered by the American Negro population of the United States has hindered the American dream. Indeed, it has. I quarrel with some other things that are said. The other deeper element of a certain awfulness I feel has to do with one's point of view, one's sense, one's system of reality. It would seem to me the proposition before the House, when I put it that way, is the American dream at the expense of the American Negro, or the American dream is at the expense of the American Negro, is a question hideously loaded. And that one's response to that question, one's reaction to that question, has to depend in effect on where you find yourself in the world, what your sense of reality is, what your system of reality is. That is, it depends on assumptions which we hold so deeply as to scarcely be aware of them. A white South African, or a Mississippi sharecropper, or a Mississippi sheriff, or a Frenchman driven out of Algeria, all have at bottom a system of reality which compels them to, for example, the Mississippi or Alabama sheriff, believe when he's facing a Negro, a boy or a girl, that this woman, this man, or this child must be insane to attack the system to which he owes his entire identity. I have to speak as one of the people who have been most attacked by what we must now here call the Western or European system of reality. The doctrine of white supremacy, I hate to say it here, comes from Europe. That's how it got to America. What everyone's reaction to this proposition is, has to be the question of whether or not civilizations can be considered as such equal, or whether one civilization has the right to overtake and subjugate and in fact destroy another. Now, what happens when that happens? Leaving aside all the physical facts which one can quote, leaving aside rape or murder, leaving aside the bloody catalog of oppression, which we are in one way too familiar with already, what this does to the subjugated, the most private, the most serious thing this does to the subjugated, is to destroy the sense of reality. It destroys, for example, his father's authority over him. His father can no longer tell him anything because the past has disappeared and his father has no power in the world. This means, in the case of the American Negro born in a living republic, since you don't know any better, every stick and stone and every face is white, and since you have not yet seen a mirror, you suppose that you are too. It comes as a great shock around the age of 5, 6, or 7 to discover the flag to which you have pledged allegiance, along with everybody else, has not pledged allegiance to you. It comes as a great shock to discover that Gary Cooper killing off the Indians, when you were rooting for Gary Cooper, that the Indians were you. It comes as a great shock to discover the country which is your birthplace and to which you owe your life and your identity has not in its whole system of reality evolved any place for you. This affection, the demoralization, and the gap between one person and another, only on the basis of the color of their skin, begins there and accelerates throughout the whole lifetime. So in the present, that you realize you're 30 and are having a terrible time managing to trust your countrymen. By the time you're 30, you have been through a certain kind of mill. And the most serious effect of this mill that you have been through is, again, not the catalog of disasters, the policemen, the taxi drivers, the waiters, the landladies, the landlords, the banks, the insurance companies, the millions of details 24 hours every day that spell out to you that you are a worthless human being. It is not that. It is by that time that you have begun to see it happening in your daughter, or your son, or your niece, or your nephew. You are 30 by now, and nothing you have done has helped you escape the trap. But what is worse than that is that nothing you have done, and as far as you can tell, nothing you can do, will save your son or your daughter from meeting the same disaster and possibly coming to the same end. Now we're speaking of expense. I suppose there are several ways to some attempt to find what the word means here. From a very literal point of view, the ports and the railroads of the country, the economy, especially of the southern states, could not conceivably be what it has become if they had not had, do not still have, and for so long, so many generations, had cheap labor. I am stating very seriously, and this is not an overstatement. I picked the cotton, and I carried it to market, and I built the railroads under someone else's whip. Nothing, or nothing. The Southern oligarchy, which has until today so much power in Washington and therefore some power in the world, was created by my labor and my sweat and the violation of my women and the murder of my children. This in the land of the free and the home of the brave, and no one can challenge that statement. It is a matter of historical record. In another way, this dream is at the expense of the American Negro. You watch this in the Deep South in great relief, but not only in the Deep South. In the Deep South, you are dealing with a sheriff or a landlord or a landlady, or the girl in the Western Union desk, and she doesn't know quite who she is dealing with. She simply knows that it is an unknown quantity, and she wants to have nothing to do with it. So she wouldn't talk to you. You have to wait a while to get your telegram. Okay, we all know this. We have all been through it. And by the time you get to a man, it is very easy to feel it. But what is happening in the poor woman's mind is this. They have been raised to believe, and by now they helplessly believe, that no matter how terrible their lives may be, and their lives have been quite terrible, that no matter how far they fall, no matter what disaster overtakes them, they have one enormous knowledge and a consolation, which is like a heavenly revelation. At least they are not black. Now I suggest that of all the terrible things that can happen to a human being, that is one of the worst. I suggest that what has happened to white Southerners is in some ways, after all, much worse than what has happened to them. Because Sheriff Clark in Selma, Alabama cannot be considered, no one can be dismissed as a total monster. I'm sure he loves his wife, his children, likes to get drunk. I'm sure that, he's, after all, one's got to assume he is visibly a man like me. But he doesn't know what drives him to use the club, to menace with a gun, and to use a cattle prod. Something awful must have happened to a human being to be able to put a cattle prod against a woman's breast. For example, what happens to the woman is ghastly. What happens to the man who does it is, in some ways, much worse. This is being done, after all, not 100 years ago, but in 1965, in a country which is blessed with what we call prosperity, a word we won't examine too closely, done with a certain kind of social coherence, which calls itself a civilized nation, which espouses the notion of the freedom of the world. It is perfectly true from the point of view now, any American Negro watching this, no matter where he is from the vantage point of Harlem, despite what the government says, we can't do anything about it, has to say to himself, but if those were white people being murdered in Mississippi work farms, being carried off to jail, if those are white children running up and down the streets, the government would find some way of doing something about it. We have a civil rights bill now. We had an amendment, the 15th Amendment, nearly 100 years ago. If the amendment was not honored then, I don't have any reason to believe that the civil rights bill will be honored now. The American soil is full of the corpses of my ancestors. Why is my freedom or my citizenship or my right to live there, how is it conceivably a question now? And I suggest further that in the same way, the moral life of Alabama sheriffs and poor Alabama ladies, white ladies, that their moral lives have been destroyed by the plague called color, that the American sense of reality has been corrupted by it. At the risk of sounding excessive, but I always felt when I finally left the country and found myself abroad in other places and watched Americans abroad, that there is something between us. We have the same shortcut. I know when I look at a girl or a boy from Tennessee, where they came from in Tennessee, and what that means. No Englishman knows that. No Frenchman, no one in the world knows that except the Black man who comes from the same place. One watches these lonely people denying the only kin they have. We talk about integration in America as though it were some great new conundrum. The problem in America is that we have been integrated for a very long time. Put me next to any African and you will see what I mean. What we are not facing is the result of what we have done. What one begs the American people to do for all our sakes is simply to accept our history. I was there not only as a slave, but also a concubine. One knows the power, after all, which can be used against another person. If you've got absolute power over that person, it seemed to me, when I watched Americans, that what they didn't know about Europeans was what they didn't know about me. They weren't trying, for example, to be nasty to the French girl or rude to the French waiter. They didn't know they hurt their feelings. They didn't have any sense that this particular woman, this particular man, though they spoke another language and had different manners and ways, was a human being. And they walked over them with the same kind of blank ignorance and condescension, charming and cheerful, with which they always patted me on the head and called me shine, and were upset when I was upset. What is relevant about this is that, whereas 40 years ago when I was born, the question of having to deal with what is unspoken by the subject, what is never said to the master, of having to deal with this reality was a very remote possibility. It was in no one's mind. When I was growing up, I was taught in American history books that Africa had no history, and neither did I. That I was a savage about whom the less said, the better, who had been saved by Europe and brought to America. And of course, I believed it. I didn't have much choice. Those were the only books there were. Everyone else seemed to agree. If you walked out of Harlem, right out of Harlem, downtown, the world agrees. What you see is much bigger, cleaner, whiter, richer, safer than where you are. They collect the garbage. People obviously pay their life insurance. The children look happy, safe. You're not. And you go back home, and it would seem that, of course, that it's an act of God that this is true, that you belong to the white people that put you. It is only since the Second World War that there's been a counter image in the world. And that image had not come about through any legislation on the part of any American government, but through the fact that Africa was suddenly on the stage of the world. And Africans had to be dealt with in a way that had never been dealt with before. This gave an American Negro for the first time a sense of himself beyond a savage or a clown. It has created and will create a great many conundrums. One of the great things that the white world does not know, but I think I do, is that the Black people are just like everybody else. One has used the myth of Negro and the myth of color to pretend and to assume that you are dealing essentially with something exotic, bizarre, and practically, according to human laws, unknown. Alas, this is not true. We are also mercenaries, dictators, murderers, liars. We are human too. What is crucial here is that unless we can manage to establish some kind of dialogue between those people who might pretend have paid for the American dream and those other people who have not achieved it, we will be in terrible trouble. I want to say at the end, at the last, is that that is what concerns me the most. We are sitting in this room and we are all, at least we like to think we are, relatively civilized, and we can talk to each other, at least on a certain levels, so that we could walk out of here assuming that the measure of our enlightenment, or at least our politeness, has some effect on the world. It may not. I remember, for example, when the ex-Attorney General, Mr. Robert Kennedy, said that it was conceivable that in 40 years in America, we might have a Negro president. And that sounded like a very emancipated statement, I suppose. They were not in Harlem when this statement was first heard and did not hear, and possibly will never hear, the laughter and the bitterness and the scorn with which this statement was greeted. From the point of view of the man in the Harlem barbershop, Bobby Kennedy only got here yesterday. And now he's already on his way to the presidency. We have been here for 400 years, and now he tells us that maybe in 40 years, if you are good, he may let you become president. What's dangerous here is the turning away from anything any white American says. The reason for the political hesitation is that one has been betrayed by American politicians for so long. None of us know how to deal with those other people whom the white world has so long ignored, who don't believe anything the white world says. And one can't blame them. It seems to me that the city of New York, for example, has had Negroes in it for a very long time. The city of New York is able, as it has indeed been able for the last 15 years, to reconstruct itself, tear down buildings, and raise great new ones downtown and for money. It has done nothing, whatever, except build housing projects in the ghetto for the Negroes. And of course, the Negroes hate it. Presently, the property does indeed deteriorate because they want to get out of the ghetto. If the American pretensions were based on more solid, more honest assessment of life and of themselves, it would not mean for Negroes, when someone says urban renewal, that Negroes simply are going to be thrown out on the street, which is what it does mean now. It is not an act of God. We are dealing with a society made and ruled by men. If the American Negro had not been present in America, I am convinced that the history of the American labor movement would be much more edifying than it is. It is a terrible thing for an entire people to surrender to the notion that 1/9 of its population is beneath them. And until that moment comes, when we, the American people, are able to accept the fact that I have to accept, for example, that my ancestors are both white and Black, that on that continent, we are trying to forge a new identity for which we need each other, and that I am not a ward of America, I am not an object of missionary charity, I am one of the people who built the country. Until we accept that moment, there is scarcely any hope for the American dream, because the people who are denied participation in it by their very presence will wreck it. And if that happens, it is a very grave moment for the West. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Baldwin. We will cast our votes by saying the aye or nay to the motion. Aye for agreeing that the American dream is at the expense of the American Negro, and nay for the contrary. Aye. Those voted in favor of the motion have carried the House. In the original version, the vote was actually 544 to 164 for a difference of 380. I declare the House to stand adjourned. So, before we start our Q&A, as you know, our society is an all-volunteer organization, and we receive no money from any other organization. We survive due to your commitment to our common goals. So we pass the basket, and thank you in advance for your generous donation. We've already adjourned from the Cambridge Union. Thank you, Atish. So just a reminder, round rules for question and answers. Raise your hand, wait for the microphone, one question at a time. let everybody get a chance to ask a question before you ask the second question. Also, if we have people on Zoom at this point, please type your questions into the chat because we have a slightly low-tech hybrid version here. I will bring the microphone down to Solomon and Fred, or else Fred will bring it down. Questions? Oh, Marge, thank you. I just want to thank both of you. That's wonderful. An excellent job. You sounded, some of your statements sounded just like. I don't.
William Buckley.
You are. I don't know. Thank you. And we have Amy.
My question is for Mr. Baldwin. In the intervening decades, have you seen any positive changes? And what would you consider to be the most negative?
Well, there clearly have been some changes. To what degree there's always been so much back and forth, and the anticipation of the equality that we are supposed to attain being so elusive, it's difficult to measure objectively how much that improvement has been. The very questions in that debate are a lot of the same questions that are still being asked and trying to get answers to.
My question is for Mr. Buckley. So you mentioned that immigrants, Jewish immigrants followed by Italians and Irish were able to bring themselves to a higher standard within a generation of coming to this country. But you've said nothing about the fact that in every Negro community in the country where the Negro people have helped each other to get ahead by having loans for students, loans for businesses, or buying homes. White people come in and destroy that community and massacre them. Maybe not in Durham where they put a freeway through it instead, but doesn't this count as significant setbacks that those other communities never suffered?
Well, I agree with you that there are many difficulties for immigrants and others in our society. And it is certainly the case that some have suffered to a greater degree than others. But ultimately, in the United States, being a mobile society, being a society that has the ability for all of us to make advancements, there is room for everyone to achieve and to become successful. And while in some cases difficulties may be greater than others, that mobile society itself is there for all to enjoy.
But still, the disparity of opportunity is enormous. You mentioned that not as many Black doctors. Well, since 1900, yes, but then just at UNC, you had to be white to go to UNC. The first Black lawyer graduated in 51 at AT&T. The first white doctor, MD at UNC Chapel Hill was 1955, just 10 years ago. And first, actually, that year, the first undergraduates. You know, you had to be white. And if you were an immigrant, if you were white, the opportunities were much greater than if you were Black. That's an obstacle you did not mention in that state.
teach.
Anyway, Mr. Buckley, there seems to be a fundamental fallacy in your point, unspoken fallacy, if I can say so, is that you have the axiomatic belief that somehow the history of the whites and the blacks began at the same time, at the same point, at the same level. I mean, it is like as if you were running a marathon and Mr. Baldwin was starting at 0 and you started at mile 25.
Well, I think what is relevant here, and I would like to just briefly say,
Mr. Buckley, please hold the mic closer to the Zoom audience.
thank you. What I would like to briefly say is that certainly everyone in the United States as an immigrant or arriving in various ways. No, they have not all had exactly the same starting point. We didn't all start at the same time in the United States. And I would suggest that the efforts that are needed for advancement and the abilities for people to advance themselves, those are there. And they just need to be taken advantage.
Well, of course, I can't disagree with the statement that the gentleman has made. He is absolutely correct that the playing field was not level. And still, in this very day, it's not level. That those opportunities that my esteemed colleague has been talking about have never been readily available for many, many, many generations for certain individuals. And like a relay race or a marathon, the difficulty of catching up, indeed, the difficulty of learning when you were not allowed to learn what these opportunities are in this American country, continues to be a disadvantage. And my esteemed colleague ignores the psychology that has been perpetuated on the American Negro insofar as being made fearful of taking advantage of these opportunities, as he would put them. That for generations upon generations, even to take advantage of these opportunities was to risk the lives of you and your family. That psychology does not just go away because someone opened the door. It is something that becomes deeply embedded, not just in the populace that has been used upon, but also on the populace that uses it. That they get used to exercising that kind of power over the subjugated. And so when my esteemed colleague speaks of it, not taking advantage of these opportunities, he ignores the fact that these opportunities were made to be feared by the population, by the dominating society. And so, of course, it is going to be difficult for American Negroes to step through doors where previously they could be hung for doing so, which is something they taught their children, to be fearful of what might happen to them because they may be perceived as ugly. That fear does not just go away because someone says so. Because why should any of these institutions be trusted? That they are now all of a sudden going to treat you as fairly as they have been, not been trained to do. They have been trained for the elevation of the white populace. They have been corrupted by the system as much as everyone else. And that corruption is that there is a dominant populace, and there is a subjugated. And they may not even be aware of these prejudices. So of course, these opportunities cannot be taken advantage of.
Thank you, Mr. Baldwin and Mr. Buckley. Audience members, I just want to mention that if you time you have a question for Mr. Bright or Mr. Pearson, just simply differentiate that so you can see who you're asking. We'll go down in order.
This is a question for Mr. Buckley and perhaps also Mr. Baldwin. Do you believe that we need a federal anti-lynching law to go along with the Civil Rights Act?
Well, there are a great many laws in the United States. I think what is needed is even application of the existing laws, because they are certainly there. Lynching, by definition, is murder, and we certainly have laws against murder. So
Mouth towards Mike, please, Mr.
I
Buckley.
would suggest that any new laws be carefully considered.
There are portions of what my esteemed colleague has said that I can agree with. That there are indeed laws that stipulate certain behaviors. That is not the overall problem. The second statement he made is what the problem actually is, and that is the fair application of these laws, which there has never truly been before. I would pose to my esteemed colleague the question, how do you get these laws to be applied fairly in a country that has never applied? And so new laws are created to shore up the inequities of the ones that my esteemed colleague is able to take such a great advantage. Now, I would agree with him that any law should be crafted with the greatest of care. But I think the emphasis should be on truly applying the current laws that he is putting his faith in to be equitable.
I can't agree with you more. That we need to truly apply them.
More questions, comments?
Going once, going twice.
Well, thank you, Mr. Buckley and Mr. Baldwin, for a fascinating and edifying debate.
However, I think the discussion is missing some pertinent observation. Not just.
We have one more statement, Mr. Baldwin.
Well, no.
No, I'm sorry, for Mr. Gibson.
Mostly because, well, one, the obvious aspect of missing from this is the question of what the actors are of the piece, as we've had to delve into it. And our understanding of what these gentlemen says and our thoughts about these gentlemen. And a kind of exploration of what they were talking about. One of the questions, why was there such a variance? What was Buckley saying? As I listened to the things, Buckley didn't really answer the question that was posed. Why is that? What was he actually talking about? Was anything that he said legitimate in certain aspects? These that have a knee-jerk reaction to what the man said, because I just don't like what he says, and he wasn't a really nice guy. But clearly he garnered some respect. So what was it in this? Jay asked the very question. Why was a lot of what he said edited? Based on that point of view. What was Baldwin's position? What was he responding? He did answer the question a couple of times, but then he embellished it like that. And I had an opinion about both of these gentlemen that they were actually cut from the same cloth. Despite their opposing views and experiences, they were both very well educated, tended to pontificate like nobody's business in making their points of view, which I found very interesting. But I just thought that some of these opportunities were missing to be able to talk about this.
Yeah, I found when studying for this that it was a bit difficult to really wrap your head around that of a guy like Buckley, and that the arguments that he made, I think, were very superficial. They didn't really address the problems at hand, and he was trying to, I think, advance a conservative agenda as editor of National Review, as to increase the sales of his magazine, perhaps. I read some history of Buckley and National Review. Buckley was very much excited about supporting the citizens' councils in the Deep South. And these were basically the Klan, in many ways. I think his goal at that was because they were buying National Review. In many ways, it was a mercenary sort of thing he was doing. Deeply motivated he was by the arguments that he was making. And we should, if there's definitely a commercial aspect to it. I think he accurately reflected in many ways, however, the white position of folks in the South and in other places in terms of their feelings about race from a white supremacist or supremacist sort of position. I think it was all there. There's a lot there that we hear today. It's quite distressing. One small observation I'll make, there was a word I said during the talk that I don't say in public or in private.
I don't say it in private.
I don't say it in private either. And when we got to Solomon, I was and I can't do that. And Solomon's comment was, you have to, because it will convey message what was really going on.
We're going around back. Dorothy, is it?
Yeah, I know we have time.
Yeah, a few minutes.
One thing I thought was really interesting, first of all, I remember Buckley, just the condescension is, he had a demeanor that was just, oh my God. But I noticed he uses they, which we're much more aware of now. He uses we when he's sort of talking about America, but he uses they when he's talking about the American Negroes. And he was even friendlier sort of to the Cambridge audience. I think he said you or maybe we, but I thought that was very clear.
The Cambridge audience was 98 or 99%. And the room was packed. And one of the comments I'll make about Buckley, and I've looked at some of the TV shows, I was alive in the 60s. And one thing I've noticed that I don't know if other people have noticed is, if you ever look at him in a chair or in some position, he is always leaning to the right. Check it out.
Yeah, but that's probably because he's right-handed.
Yes.
Yeah.
One more top.
And that'll be it.
Yeah, you want to know the interesting thing as an actor that seems to be consistent with white actors with goodwill, say, is that whenever they have to say something derogatory word like that, what Leonardo DiCaprio problem Daniel Unchained, is that the black actor has to walk over to him and say, it's all right, it's not hard. You've got like cultures and lines. Oh, so you're fine.
Most memorable moment for me.
Let's please give another round of applause to these two. All right, now, announcements. Do people have any announcements that they would like to share with us? Anybody, anything, any announcements whatsoever? Then I will take over. My announcement is, do not come here next week, because we will not be here. It is a Zoom only Sunday. It is an environmental program because later on in April, April 22nd, I believe, is Earth Day. So it will be a program in honor of that. We look forward to seeing you there. We will send you out more information via the weekly newsletter. Last chance for any sort of announcements. Mike has an announcement. Michael, wait, because I don't have to like to. Yes, the Zoom people.
Say, spot on the 15th of joy.
I have no idea what Mike is saying, so he'll send an email later. In the meantime, I would love to invite Jay back up for closing words. He was an awesome mentor. Atish, did you have an announcement? Oh, Atish has a question. Hold on.
Is this not of those? This program was recorded.
Yeah.
So it will be on the website. Is it possible to put it on the AEU?
Don't ask me on our website.
Okay. Well, thank you.
That it? As good as this presentation was, I would recommend that everybody Google the YouTube and watch the original. It's just incredible on both those men, and especially James Baldwin. It's just striking as good as what the orator is that he is and was. And what's else is a little more backstory. That was the first time I understand that he participated in a formal debate setting. So it was kind of new to him. He fell back on some of his preacher roots, I guess, and it was just incredible.
Yeah, you might also say that in the original Baldwin first,
Yes,
he took some liberties.
they switched the order. Mr. Baldwin went first at Cambridge. Here we have Mr. Buckley go first. And I would add another footnote to that. When you watch the video in the original, that Taft Union stood immediately as one for a lengthy standing ovation to James Balwin. And observers said they'd never seen that happen in the more than 100 years of debates in that place. So it was really moving. Well, to go back and quote a little bit more backstory from author Nicholas Nicola. The aftermath was the day after his triumph in Cambridge. Baldwin heard about the violence in Marion, Alabama, that would lead to the death of Jimmy Lee Jackson. 2 days later, he received word that his friend Malcolm X had been assassinated. And about 2 weeks further on, the U.S. would witness Bloody Sunday, vicious attack on civil rights marchers fighting for voting rights in Alabama. Meanwhile, Buckley was busy trying to explain away his loss in Cambridge. He called it, quote, an orgy of anti-Americanism, rather than a meaningful exchange of ideas. Buckley would later say that he had never lost a debate by such a wide margin, but it was the debate about which he had the most pride, because he refused to, quote, give them one goddamn inch. A few weeks later, Buckley would have a chance to avenge his defeat at Baldwin's hands. One of the kings of American television, David Susskind, invited Baldwin and Buckley onto his show, Open End, to engage each other once again. When they did, Buckley got the better of Baldwin by getting under his skin in a way that led Baldwin to, quote, tune out. He would later say, it was to my eternal dishonor. The Open End exchange led Baldwin to conclude that Buckley was a bully who was unwilling to listen, and if he had to do it all over again, he would have, quote, hit Buckley over the head with his coffee cup. And
I can certainly understand the temptation towards violence. That man tended to make me feel violent every time I watched him. But I would like to thank a bunch of people. Our greeter, Jan, first reader for the spring quarter, for helping all of our various and sundry guests and members feel welcome. Thank you, Jay, for opening words, closing words, and heckling words in the middle. That was awesome. A big thank you to Solomon and Fred, because I watched only a couple of their rehearsals and work, and they put a lot into it. So another round.
One chat comment that came in actually quite a bit earlier. Jennifer Williams, hang on, I lost it now. I gotta find it again. She wanted mention of the change of change to the IFC.
Okay.
So that is, I guess, the new group we're contributing to starting this month.
So anybody who has any pocket change or any pocket dollars or any pocket pennies, feel free to donate to the Change for Change jar. Go to the IFC, which in fact we are collecting food for today, although some of us may have forgotten. Thank you, Jennifer. I appreciate that.
For those that are help out on the setup schedule, I printed out some copies of the new one if you want to take a printed out version. And also let me know if you have any changes to what I have.
As far as thanks goes, I want to thank Gretchen and also yell at her because her refreshments smelled so good while I was sitting there that I almost didn't make it through. And thank you also for John for stepping up to be Mr. Zoom. Our meeting is over, but our fellowship continues. Please give a warm greeting to the person next to you, or in the case of Zoom boxes, we have it in the box. We have lovely refreshments in the back. Due to the ongoing pandemic, please make sure that you wash your hands, social distance, and be considerate of people near you. Thanks so much for coming.